Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about some official news that just came out for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Remake for Nintendo Switch 2, and there are some big implications here. At first glance, it may not seem like that big of a deal, but I think when we take a deeper look, talk about what it actually may mean and how it compares to prior versions of Ocarina of Time, we are looking at something here that is going to end up being actually a fairly big, interesting deal. And what I'm getting at here is the recent news that came out that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time for Switch 2 will have an ESRB rating of E10 and up. And there are a few little details here, a few little nuggets that when we dig deeper actually mean something quite interesting. And so that's what we're diving into today. Now before going forward, let me point out I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers. I'm hoping to hit this goal very soon. We are getting so close. So if you find yourself enjoying my videos and you haven't subscribed already, you subscribing would be very much appreciated. So yes, the official news here is that when you take a look at the official Nintendo website for Ocarina of Time on Switch 2, it is now rated E10 and up for having animated blood and fantasy violence, and that is basically the new information here. But let's now talk about how it compares to prior ratings for Ocarina of Time and other Zelda games. So the original Ocarina of Time had an E rating. That's a little bit different, but the reason why is because when we go back in 2005, they actually added the E10 and over rating, so that's why there is a big difference there. And so we take a look at Ocarina of Time 3D, it is E10 and up, and here they say for animated blood, fantasy violence, and suggestive themes. And what you might notice here, there's a little bit of a difference. It's just animated blood and fantasy violence, not suggestive themes. And so what has changed? We'll dive into that. But also taking a look at Breath of the Wild, E10 and up, Tears of the Kingdom also E10 and up. So it just kind of seems like modern Zelda, that's just where the rating has been at. However, for Breath of the Wild, there was fantasy violence, as was for Tears of the Kingdom, and also for the upcoming Ocarina of Time. Where there are differences is in the other details, where Breath of the Wild had mild suggestive themes, as did Tears of the Kingdom. That is not mentioned for Ocarina of Time, interestingly. But Breath of the Wild also had use of alcohol, Tears of the Kingdom did not. Ocarina of Time has animated blood, like the 3DS version. So why are we seeing some of these subtle differences here? Well, we are seeing that the Ocarina of Time remake is missing the suggestive themes part. And some people are speculating that that may have to do with the fact that in the original Ocarina of Time, you look at characters like the Great Fairies, and the way they were depicted, well, was very revealing. However, back in the day, back in the 90s, due to the simplicity of the visuals, this kind of look Nintendo could get away with. And so basically looking at the Great Fairies in the N64 and 3DS version for Ocarina of Time, they were basically naked but with some vines covering them. And these games had low texture detail, low resolution, but now on Nintendo Switch 2, the remake is going to be a high fidelity game at a high resolution, perhaps even in 4K. And so odds are Nintendo's going to depict the Great Fairies a bit differently, and what we're seeing here with this ESRB rating could be suggestive of that, because now we're seeing a lack of suggestive themes. And ultimately what I think this means is that we're going to be seeing significant redesigns across the board. When we take a look at the teaser trailer, we can already tell that the Deku Tree looks substantially different than the original Deku Tree. It has far more vines and branches and roots, a far more intricate looking canopy, far more involved facial features and hair or a beard of sorts through the vines and branches and all that sort of stuff. The Deku Tree is being depicted rather differently. And then we take a look at Link, he is also being depicted rather differently. His clothes are different, there are layers to it, he's covered in leaves. You look at his hat, it has additional little accessories and such. The room itself has a different structure physically. And so even though the teaser trailer is very short, there's already some clear indications here that we are going to be seeing some substantial redesigns And I think it stands to reason that there's also going to be redesigns across the board, including with something like the Great Fairies where it would be needed due to the ESRB rating. I do not think that means that when we see the Great Fairies redesigned, that they're going to be depicted in a way where we won't be able to recognize them, or they still won't kind of have that essential look, but it's going to be done in a way where it may be perceived as a little bit less risque. Because if the Great Fairies were depicted with the level of realism and higher quality that we're promised to get with the Ocarina of Time remake, then they wouldn't be able to get away with the same rating, in my opinion. Now, something else I consider, though, is that there are other references in the dialogue for Ocarina of Time that have me thinking where there are some suggestive themes, and it makes me wonder, are they getting rid of those bits of dialogue? When we take a look at the teaser trailer, from what we gather, it's very similar to the introduction to Ocarina of Time, which has us believe that this is essentially the new version of the introduction to the game, the beginning of the game, but there are some very key differences, such as the narrator being different, it no longer being the Deku Tree, but someone else. Could it be that we're going to see just a whole bunch of different dialogue and scenes and scripts and just words just changed dramatically? If so, there could be moments where there might have been some suggestive themes that are no longer there. For example, the Poe Shop, where it suggested that Link's body could be used for financial gain, which is certainly a suggestive theme. So with the lack of a mention of a suggestive theme in the Switch 2 version, are things like that going to be taken out? I'm not going to actually jump to that conclusion, because something like that may be very subtle, obviously open for interpretation, but I'm also not going to sit here and act like it's unlikely that they are going to make changes like this, because the way Nintendo may see Zelda now and how it should be presented to the masses likely has shifted since 1998. It's been nearly 30 years. 28 years since the original Ocarina of Time release. Nintendo may not want those kinds of suggestive themes in the game. That said, we take a look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. They also have E10 ratings, and there are still things in these games that are suggestive themes, that are dark. I don't feel like there is something lost in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom because they hit an E10 rating. The stories, the world, the overall atmosphere is fitting. However, what I will say is this. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom go for a cel-shaded art style, and it's going to be nice to see a Zelda game that goes for a different direction after so many years. We already know we're getting that from what we've seen briefly of the gameplay footage of Ocarina of Time. They're going for something far more realistic looking, with a lot more detail, more realistic depictions here, more realistic lighting, and I do think this is going to have some big implications when we consider how the game is going to be depicted, as I mentioned with the Great Fairies earlier. But something else that needs to be considered here is the mention of animated blood. While this was still an element in the ESRB rating for prior versions of Ocarina of Time, this time around it may be a bigger deal. So something we've discussed in the past is when we compare the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time to the N64 version, there are details that are changed. Ocarina of Time on the 3DS is presented in a far more colorful, bright way. It's far more vivid. In various scenarios, I would argue there's actually something lost when it comes to the overall darker tone and atmosphere. And when taking a look at the bottom of the well in the Shadow Temple, depictions of blood are muddied up quite a bit. It's far more vague. And then even looking at the N64 version of Ocarina of Time, there was this moment where Ganondorf coughs up blood, and the original version was red, but in later versions it was green. How will these things be handled in the Switch 2 remake? And you see, what's interesting about this is that because this game is going to be at a higher resolution, with far better detail, with far better clarity, in this modern era where we hold things to a much greater standard, certain decisions that were made for the N64 version or the 3DS version won't quite slide and be as effective in today's era. So having visual details where you can't quite make out what it is, leaving some more room for interpretation by the eye, that's something they could get away with in the N64 version or the 3DS version. You can't really get away with this Switch 2 version. Nintendo will have to make some clear decisions. So when it comes to the depictions of blood in the bottom of the well in the Shadow Temple, it's going to need to be more apparent. And I hope they don't wash these things away. The ESRB rating's already making mention of animated blood, so we know they're not doing away with animated blood. But the other challenge here is that with more realistic visuals, things are more clear, more obvious. And so when Ganondorf coughs up blood, is that going to look like realistic blood, gooey and drippy? Or is it going to be something else that's perhaps open for interpretation? Like, if they do the whole green blood thing, that's probably a lot easier to keep the rating down. But on the flip side, because they would be going for more realism here, if Ganondorf were to cough up green blood, that would be really weird to look at. Now, another angle to consider here is that this game is probably not going to be a one-to-one remake. I've already talked about how we are seeing substantial redesigns here. We are seeing structurally the game, at least from a little bit we've seen so far, is different. Nintendo's been very consistent about referring to this game as being reborn across time. No, I'm not referencing just like a single tweet as they did with Skyward Sword once, but across the board on the website, in the marketing, in magazines, in the direct, and also on social media posts, they are referencing this game as being reborn, which is more than just mentioning it one time like they did with Skyward Sword, which, in my opinion, is suggestive of the overall vision for this game, which it is a rebirth here, implying, yeah, this is more, a lot of elements are going to be reimagined. And so when I say that, I consider moments like where Gandalf may cough up blood. They may handle things in a way where you're not going to see the blood, but you're going to see him cough up, and maybe it's darker so you can't quite tell what it is, but it still looks dark, it still looks intimidating, you can still tell that he's coughing up likely blood, but you don't just like obviously clearly see like gooey red blood coming out of his mouth, nor do you see like just unrealistic green blobs coming out either. It's just presented in a way where you can tell, but in a tasteful manner that is respective of the E10 rating. And it wouldn't be surprised if there are other moments like that as well. And because they're going for this greater sense of realism here, not hyper-realistic per se, but greater sense of realism in comparison to any other prior Zelda, I have an optimism that that original mood and tone is going to be delivered here, obviously in a modern way, with for sure some differences, but something that I think will be appropriately representative of one of the greatest games ever made. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.